You could take the speed train off and clean it separately, but if you do, there's a price to be paid, because getting the adjustment right for the speeds afterwards is a bit of a trial with these compours, and I would rather avoid that. So I'm just flushing this with some naphtha, and I'll blow that excess out. Just check the action of that now. Oh yeah, that's good. That's nice and free. So I can assemble these components. There's two options with the blade actuating ring. You can lubricate it very lightly with some molybdenum paste, or just lubricate it with graphite powder. In this case I'm going to lubricate it with graphite powder, because I'm going to use graphite powder to lubricate the retard gear train anyway. Put our retainer plate in place. This has a little locating stud right here which locates it in position. And this is held in with 4 screws. 3 of them are the same length, and they're short. One of them is long, and the short ones are used because if they protruded through the other side of the plate in those positions, they would foul something. That's the other short one. If you're taking one apart, it doesn't hurt to mark the position of where the long screw goes. I happen to know it goes here, but it's not uncommon to find a little mark on the mechanism plate where somebody has marked it, so they know the position for the longer screw. All the screws are in position, and go around and tighten them up. Check that the blade actuating ring is free. It certainly is. And the lever that operates the blade actuating ring from the top of the mechanism plate needs to be cleaned. There's not much to go wrong with the top surface. The underside surface, if that was covered in sticky grease or something, that would cause that to not move smoothly. I'll take a bit of molybdenum paste, just lubricate the pivot hole and the slot. The slot is where it connects to the blade actuating ring. And molybdenum paste, you only need a tiny touch of it, really. Just requires very little indeed. It's just like leaving a dirty mark on it. I'll hook the spring back on there, and the action should be snappy. That's good. And the blade actuating ring now I want to lubricate with some graphite powder, and the same with their retard gear train there. So I'll pop that to one side. First, I think I'll just clean these shutter blades, which is sitting here, since I've got the paper sitting here ready to go. I'll inspect the blades first, see what state they're in. If they're heavily marked, I'll polish them with some Brasso. If they're not heavily marked, then it's probably sufficient just to clean them with naphtha. When you're cleaning them like this, you will feel if there's any roughness on the surface of the blade, any light surface corrosion, you will feel it as a resistance on the cotton, the tip of the cotton bud as you run it across there, and that will alert you that there's a problem that you might need to deal with. Normally shutter blades gather up oil that has come from elsewhere in the camera, typically the focus helical, and it just vaporizes in one place and condenses in another. You can be sure that it'll condense somewhere you don't want it, which is typically the blades, the shutter blades, the diaphragm blades, or indeed the innermost surfaces of the lens. So those blades are all clean. They all appear very good to me, so I'm just going to pop them to one side and see about lubricating my mechanism plate. Oh, a little bit of graphite powder. What I want to do is just work it in to the blade actuating ring. That's all that's required. You need very little of it. And some in the retard gear train. So I'll just hold back the pallets with my finger here and swing the lever in and out. And now I just need to blow any excess powder away. So I'll go and do that. Okay, that's all good. Now graphite powder is generally used on a shutter that is freshly serviced and is clean, dry and free from any oil or grease. Oil or grease would mean that the powder would clump up and it wouldn't be working as expected. I'll just unhook that spring from the lever, swing the lever into the blade's open position and start fitting my shutter blades. And they start here. Oops. The first blade has an extra hole in it. The extra hole serves no other function other than to tell you that it's the first blade. Now why they did that I'm not entirely sure, because all the blades are otherwise identical. I imagine that the reason is historical, and once upon a time it made a difference. Alright, so there's our blades sitting in position, and now I can fit the case. Now first I'll turn my blade, my aperture setting ring to expose the holes the screw holes here in the case. This only goes on in one direction, and I've just got to figure out which way it is, and I think it's this way. That looks promising. Check those screw holes line up, and they do. Something doesn't want to line up there. I just felt something seat, so that should be okay. There should be a fourth hole over here somewhere. Is that screw head catching on there? That one? That one. Alright. Yeah, this screw goes in here. But it's reluctant. That's better. Yeah, the slot in the screw here is very narrow, so it means that my screwdriver is perched pretty much right on the top of it instead of going down into the groove. And there's our other hole around at that end of the travel. It's not lining up quite correctly there. I might need to loosen the other screws up first. And of course I can't get to those because I've put that stop screw in place. And just slacken these two screws up. Get this screw in position. Still doesn't want to line up. Okay, I can only assume I've got something in the wrong place. Let's back these screws out. Generally speaking, the screws aren't symmetrically placed around the shutter, so if you get two of them in, usually you're good to go. I can only assume that I've got it in the wrong place. Shutter blades are undisturbed, that's good. That's got to go there. There we go. It appears good. And tighten those 3 screws up. They're the main case screws. Now I can put this stop screw in position. And the stop screw probably limits the travel of that aperture setting ring to the most useful part of the range. In other words, it stops at f2.8, doesn't go all the way through to an f2 position that would be doing nothing. Swing the blades in, hook the return spring back in place. That's all moving nicely. Check that the diaphragm moves freely, and that stop screw stops the maximum aperture at f2.8 as expected. That stop screw, of course, is also the locator. It locates the shutter in the camera housing so that the shutter doesn't have a tendency to rotate while you're swinging the cocking lever across. That's all good, and I can start assembling the control gear on the top of the mechanism plate. But of course I really need to clean that first. I'll just clean these components. They're already quite clean. I'm just making sure that there's no contamination on them. This piece in particular is actually 2 pieces with a spring holding them together. It's quite easily disturbed. It's not particularly easy to get back together. Take a bit of caution with that. This wheel drives the pallet wheel. Just putting a smear of molybdenum paste around the toe of that wheel. That's where it activates the flash contact, and it's pretty important that that moves smoothly. This is the pallets here. The pallets are slightly rounded on one surface, dead flat on the other. The dead flat surface goes down. The rounded surface stops that effectively catching on anything or rubbing on anything or creating a high friction area. The flat surface, the whole thing is sitting up on a boss on that post, on a shoulder, so that the flat surface underneath doesn't rub on anything either. Okay, so that looks okay. Put this lever in position. My tweezers are somewhat worn out. I'm having trouble getting them to hold things. That's better. It's a definite position for this thing. It's about there, and that's because it has to clear this lever in one position. Right, so I'll put the flash contact in place. Let's put the flash post in place first. It just fits down into the case. Presses down. And it's held in place with a single screw. The screw in this case is black. The spring here is the high speed spring, the 500th of a second spring. It provides extra impetus to the shutter to make the shutter fire at the higher speed. Flash contact has to go in underneath that. Sometimes it's difficult getting this thing seated over its post. Yeah, that's good. A single screw holds that in position. It's quite a long countersunk head screw. Now this little lever is trying to jump out of position there. Let's see if I can get that seated correctly on there. It's okay. Just checking the position of this, making sure that the tip of that lever will run along that flat surface towards the toe of that piece there. That's correct. And finding a good pair of tweezers, and I've got to stretch this spring out and hook it over the post. So it's a case of finding a pair of tweezers that are not too fine and have good strong tips that aren't distorted too much. Hold this spring, hook it into the hole on that lever there, stretch the spring out, hook it over the post here on that speed train. That's okay, that looks correct. This plate at the top has this lever on it. This lever here, its job is to hold the shutter in the cocked position. It's what the release acts on. I'll just clean this. It's important that that lever is free to move. If there's any oil or anything between these two surfaces, it can tend to stick, and that can stop the shutter from cocking correctly. It'll cock, but it won't remain cocked because this lever might not fall down into position correctly. There are two standoffs here and here. And there's a spring that goes on this plate which is currently not in position. I'll see if I can get that in position. It's much easier to fit it at this stage than it is to fight with it later. Slides around that post there. Like all springs, it would like to disappear, and it's just done it. Right, I'll find that. Well, I've got that spring back. A quick sweep round the room with the magnet did it. One of these is a wonderful thing to have for chasing small screws and springs. It's a magnet from my old welding bench. See if we can get this spring on there without it disappearing. That's a bit better. And see if I can get this plate swung into position without disturbing anything else. This has to fit over 2 posts, and the tip of this plate has to hook under a spot in the frame just there. That's it. That lever sits over there. Plain screw at this end. And our lever goes at this end. Get that under that spring without losing anything. That has a shoulder screw that holds that in position. This is probably a job for 2 pairs of tweezers. The lever's much smaller on a Retina 2A camera, and as a result it's easier to get it to perch there while you're trying to get the screw in place. That spring is doing its best to get away. Yeah, it certainly is. Alright, let me see if I can get that screw down in place first. And then fit the spring. Alright. Okay, that's in position. You can see the detent action of that spring. That's good. I want to put the B lever in next. Oh, I've got to change this video camera battery too.